Thank you, Mark, and thank you, everyone, for being here. I am Leslie McIntosh, and I am the VP of Research Integrity and Security of Digital Science. I'm also the founder of Forensic Scientometrics and come from a background of epidemiology and biostatistics. I hope that you believe me on that because credentials are actually very important, and that's one of the things that we're going to go into in this talk called The Battle of Knowledge, for Knowledge. If you read my blog, you will have heard a lot of this, but when I wrote this at the beginning of the year, I thought, oh wow, this is more of a keynote than it is a blog, and I feel very passionate about this, so bear with me on this talk. If the recent past was characterized by an unprecedented influx of data that, with the assistance of the internet, was transformed into information, then the present moment is something different entirely. We are now fully engaged in a power struggle over knowledge itself. Who controls the words controls the narrative. Who controls the narrative controls the minds and the culture. And who controls the minds controls what is seen as true, legitimate, and even thinkable. Words. Let's stop to think about words for a minute. It would be easy to argue that the oversimplification of vocabulary has reduced people's ability to think, that shrinking language leads to shrinking thought, and that this plays out at the level of entire populations. We're seeing this with AI. And that argument is not wrong, but it is incomplete. There is another dynamic at work, the overcomplication of thinking, the relentless bombardment of decisions, the exhaustion that comes not from ignorance, but from having to constantly choose, interpret, configure, and assess. Here is my rant. How many of you have a smart device, a smart oven, a smart TV? Mine's a smart oven. I moved into this house, I love it, but it's not connected to the internet, by the way. Do you know how many times I struggle to even start my oven? How do I turn it on? There's one dark button. What do I want to do? Normal cooking or something else? Do I want to heat up plates? How much time do I need? What temperature? Where is the start button? The oven is simultaneously smart, but so very, very dumb. And the experience is exhausting. This anecdote is a small-scale example of a broader condition, decision fatigue, as a feature of modern knowledge systems. When everything requires configuration, interpretation, and judgment, our cognitive bandwidth is consumed before any meaningful thinking begins. Even when you don't need meaningful thoughts, you just need a preheated oven. Oversimplification dulls thoughts. Overcomplication overwhelms it. Both are tools of control. The result is not only fatigue, but misdirection. This happens within, around, and to science. Attention pulled toward what is easiest to measure or understand rather than what is most consequential. When we look at contemporary discussions of research security, for example, the focus is typically narrow, measurable, and ultimately insufficient. We hear about dual affiliations and worry about undeclared ones, people working at two institutions and not declaring them. We hear about dual-use technologies, research that could be a boon for any country, but that might also give a strategic advantage to an economic or geopolitical competitor. Chip manufacturing is the canonical example here. These are real concerns, but they represent a very specific lens. Research security, as it is commonly framed, focuses on inputs and outputs, who is involved, where funding comes from, and how results might be misused. What it rarely interrogates is research as knowledge infrastructure, as a system that shapes narratives, norms, and legitimacy. Research security also typically sits at the university and government levels, but publishers are involved in this. Now consider other communities that explicitly study power and control. If you look at intelligence communities, MI5, MI6, the FBI, They look at cyber attacks, espionage, art theft, economic sabotage. They are waking up to what the field that we are in, but really, do they look at scholarly publishing, peer review manipulation, citation networks? Minimal attention is given. Research appears boring, it's slow, it's esoteric. It does not feel like a lever of power, which is precisely why it is one. The published research paper holds value because it holds vetted knowledge, knowledge that has passed, however imperfectly, through peer review, knowledge that has been edited, contextualized, and debated, knowledge that other researchers cite, critique, and build upon. This vetting is tenuous, yes. It is flawed, absolutely. But it is still one of the few large-scale mechanisms we have for producing trusted knowledge. And trusted knowledge is powerful. Even flawed knowledge, once embedded in citation networks, begins to shape narratives. It can influence courts, regulation, public perception. It can train AI systems that then reproduce its authority at scale. This is the battle for knowledge, not dramatic espionage, not cinematic sabotage, but infrastructure-level manipulation of what becomes accepted as true. Open science expanded to scientific outputs, and that was necessary. But openness without structural maturity accelerates contamination. Security without openness, though, risks authoritarian control. And the goal of open science, of restriction, of monitoring, is not restriction. The goal is resilience. Science has never promised certainty. It has never promised a system capable of correcting itself. It has promised, a system capable of correcting itself over time. But correction requires infrastructure, and infrastructure requires more than norms. It requires expectation setting, monitoring, and oversight that are not merely encouraged, but institutionalized. So the question is not whether we believe in open science. The question is whether we are willing to treat science as the high-impact knowledge infrastructure that it actually is. Because if we don't, others will. Let me show you what happens when that maturity is missing. We have imposters. By definition, they are not who they say they are. They are a fictitious persona, an organization not based on a known person or fronting an organization. This is an example of a fictitious author, Dragan Rodriguez. If you look in here, this person was made up. This person is still associated in databases with Case Western University, even though this person never existed. We also have impersonators who take the identity or the relationship of another and make it their own. You will see people taking deceased researchers and using their names now. And that is to not necessarily to get tenure, but to build something. It could be individual, it could be something for their company, it could be something geopolitical. And we also have cats, because cats are everywhere. If you look up the Morrises that are in the research literature, you will know that some people have added their cats as authors, which some of us may agree with. Let me take you through another one that I've been working on, and I'm not going to go through complete details because I do want to leave time for Q&A in this. The Pharmacon Neuroscience Network, which is an authorship for sale network that I identified in 2022. This is one that came up on a tweet. I didn't know it at the time. I just read this tweet. This was before it became musky and changed and science Twitter was going. And somebody was very upset because they said that their paper was being plagiarized. And I said, well, let me see if I can tell, not by the words in the paper, but the structure of it, those trust markers that I look for. Trust in the authors. Now, when I look at authors, and when I was looking then, I was looking for a history of publication. I was looking for perhaps any anomalies that showed up. I'm not looking for a specific country to try to say, oh, they're not good, because let's be real, most countries have dodgy people, except for, I think, Antarctica, who doesn't actually have anybody who's legally Antarctic. This came up as strange because they had two emails that seemed very similar, one with an underscore and one with a dash. These are subtle, subtle differences, but they can be discovered. The other thing that caught me on this one is they acknowledge a funder that I wasn't familiar with. Now, I had an intern from Bangladesh, so I could also, who could help me figure out, whether something might not be in our system but might be usable, but no. What this was a group, well, and it still is to some degree, that was using the name of a fictitious funder in order to what appears to be find one another and give legitimacy to themselves to do their research. And they rapidly increased in research. What you'll see is a drop-off because once I started making things public, they stopped doing what they were doing. Some of them moved on to other things. What did we see? 120 publications, and within a couple of years have had over 6,000 citations. There are authors without identifiers. Now, I looked at this recently, so there are 29 authors that do not have identifiers, which means they have not published again. They do not have an ORCID. They do not have some identifier that we use within our database. Why are they on a publication? People do this so that it gives them clout. They may be working for someone else. They may be wanting a visa for another country. So that gets them into a network that they wouldn't necessarily be authorized. Before anyone says, oh, but this is happening in certain countries, if you noticed some of the names, they sounded like they were from the Middle East. One was from Bangladesh, one was from Saudi Arabia. Yes, but 40 countries are affected. All continents, again, I'm picking on Antarctica, is not on this list, right? Every other continent is. There are organizations that also don't have identifiers. In fact, there are 3 organizations that are very interesting. One is a house in the suburb of Sydney, Australia. One was an apartment in Vienna that was over a massage parlor. And another one is in California in the United States. Anybody can say anything if we do not have a structure to look and check for trust within our ecosystem. What happens? Some of these people went on to get funding from legitimate sources, from Croatia, from Ireland, from Portugal, from Russia. Not just those. There are people that have many, many millions of funding that were in the United States, in the UK. So we have investigated what happens when people like me go and investigate. Well, I'm going to say that Croatia has been amazing to work with, and they want to do something about having legitimate researchers within their funding, right? Other countries, it's different. So I ask you this, in giving those examples, who are we? And do we need to define who we are within the research ecosystem? Who belongs, who is excluded, and what expectations we set for researchers in terms of publication practices? Now, I base a lot of my work on trust markers, these individual elements important to understand, clarify, and categorize trust in science. I'm specifically going to really dive into authorship right now. Who has the right to be an author on a paper? Who can be an author? Who should be an author? And what are the expectations for authorship in our scholarly community? This may be uncomfortable, but we need to be asking those questions. Otherwise, anybody can write anything, anywhere, and we are no different in the scholarly ecosystem than the internet is. So this came up in 2016 when preprints were still in debate about the use. And the assumption that I thought was interesting on this is that the author is a scientist or an expert, when in fact anyone can currently say anything. We, as a scholarly community, do not hold the narrative with who and when someone can publish right now. So let us ask ourselves, who can publish? Is it enough that you are studying, you are a graduate student, that you can publish? Or should you have graduated and be a trainee? Then are you allowed to publish something? Do you need to move on to be a scholar, right? To have graduated, have the training, and be the scholar. Do you need all three? Do you need all three and be affiliated with a research institution? Now, I think the answer is somewhere in between, right? But we need to make some critical decisions about who can be trusted as an author. And let me tell you, if you're worried about discriminating against people who are under-resourced or in areas that are under-resourced, let me tell you, those that do not play the game of gamifying science right now, who are trying to do things legitimately, are being discriminated against. We need to make decisions. In the US, I think is one of the countries that says it most clearly about who can be an expert. So this is somebody who goes into court and testifies. They possess knowledge beyond that of a layperson, and they need to have qualifications in education, training, and experience. The British law, the Australian laws, I believe it's the Kenyan laws, they're not all that different either, but this one says it as succinctly as possible, so I used that. So I ask you again, who can be an author, who should be an author, and what are the expectations for authorship in our scholarly community? Let's also talk about what is science. Now, I'm using the definition of science from the Greek when science was a branch of philosophy, representing knowledge and inquiry. Science began as a humanistic inquiry into nature, ethics, and meaning. We in the scientific, scholarly community start having a legitimate discussion about, are we talking STEM, are we talking about the humanities? I would say if we are looking externally from our science community, we need to stop arguing about that externally, right? People don't understand the nuances, and if we argue, that argument is carried over rather than the trust and the understanding that we have in science. Science is more than methods. It is greater than the collective people and the institutions that make up research. It is a knowledge system, an infrastructure that stabilizes expectations, coordinates actors, and distributes authority. Most of the things, though, that happen in science right now that are nefarious, that are dodgy, are not activities that are in violation of any of the laws of any state. So there is no crime. So it may be awful that there are citation cartels, that there are paper mills, that there are people faking institutions. Those are all awful, but they are lawful right now. We need to do something, like fix how things are presented. I would say we can take inspiration from art. In art authentication, you look at provenance, properties, and professionals. I also think that we can take inspiration from art in a very strange way. How many of you just paint, amateur painters, or love to paint? Anyone? Great. Do any of you paint from the masters? Take a Van Gogh and try to paint it? Or, okay. Is there anything illegal about that? Absolutely not. Unless we try to sell that, then that's illegal. But I actually take inspiration from this because people copy what is valued. People are still copying being a professor. They're copying papers, the scholarly literature. which may sound very strange, but it means that they're still worth something in our society, and that is inspiring. Mark, that's all the inspiration you get from this talk, though, because I know you put it up there. I do think that scholarship authentication is the same way. We can look at the provenance of the scholarship, we can look at the properties, and we can look and have professionals. I also think that there's one other way, and this is draft mode, so you're the first to not see this, but you're going to be the first to see the next slide. In December 2025, the Ada Lovelace Institute put out this policy briefing called Great Public Expectations, presenting public views on regulatory AI needs. And the thought is, and I know it's a little bit hard to see, but the idea is that there are other sectors that have regulation across industries. Aviation, the financial industry, pharma, the food industry. Their point is that AI does not have those regulations. And I had been thinking, every time I get on a plane, I really hope that the pilot is a pilot, who they say they are, and I hope they have the qualifications, right? I trust that the airline has vetted them to get on and be that pilot. So I was thinking, well, what do we have within our scholarly system? And is it influential? Is it voluntary? Or is it mandated? And I would argue that we have some of these things, the safety standards. COPE talks about our safety standards, but it is influential. It is not actually mandatory. You will see a lot of journals that come on that say they agree with COPE, but they aren't members of COPE. So they're playing the game of using something that is influential for a safety standard, but they are not actually using those standards. So I leave you with a couple of potential solutions and some final thoughts. We live in an era where information is more open than ever before. Yet in breaking down barriers to communication, we have too often neglected to build the scaffolding of trust that sustains a healthy research ecosystem. This is a battle for knowledge as it exists today. It's not a single front, but a diffuse struggle across infrastructures, incentives, and attention. It unfolds in peer review systems stretched beyond capacity, in metrics that reward volume over validity, in AI systems trained on vast, unexamined corpora of authoritative text. This battle for knowledge is visible in the quiet fatigue of editors, reviewers, and readers, people who must constantly decide what to trust and what to ignore, and what they no longer have the energy to question. It touches universities responsible for their researchers. It rests on librarians, the underappreciated guardians of the scholarly record. Research integrity, research security, and public trust in science are not separate conversations. They are different entry points into the same arena. And in that arena, science cannot be merely open. It must become secure and trusted knowledge. We often describe science as innovation, disruption, paradigm shifts, revolutions. But science is also tradition. Not a tradition of conclusions, a tradition of methods, a tradition of verification, of documentation, of critique, of correction. Peer review, citations, archiving, even retractions are some traditions in our scientific arena. These are not bureaucratic rituals. They are mechanisms of knowledge continuity. I don't know about you, but I was very inspired by the opening ceremony of the Olympics in Milano recently. And I never thought I would get inspiration from a businessman and sportsman, but Giovanni Malago really inspired me when he said, "Tradition is not the worship of ashes, but the preservation of fire." Tradition is not the worship of ashes, but the preservation of fire. We are the stewards of that fire. So the real question is not whether science is open and secure, it is whether it is resilient. And that depends on us. What are we doing here in this venue to preserve the fire of knowledge? Thank you. Question and answer.
I'll go first. Mark did tell me to be controversial, so I'll try and word this in a slightly controversial way. I've spent about 10 years now trying to convince academics to do things that they don't tend to want to do. And I agree with everything you said, but none of that is going to work if academics aren't forced to do it, which is a kind of sad reality. So could you talk a little bit about the consequences for not doing these things? So DORA is a really good example. DORA is this thing that a lot of institutions have signed up to, but in practice have not necessarily done a very good job all the time of implementing the principles. And there's no consequence for not doing that. They can still say they're part of DORA, they still get all the credit for doing it. So how do we actually enforce some of these things, and what kind of consequences could we put in place for people who don't do it?
Can I ask, where are you coming from? Are you at an institution? Are you at a publisher?
Not anymore. I was in academia for about 8 years, and now I'm outside of it.
Okay. Thank you for that question, and I love controversy, so that's good. I would say one of the first things that we have to do is stop looking at what somebody else needs to do to fix the problem, because there are problems in every part of our ecosystem. What I would argue here is that institutions need to step up and figure out and help understand, how do you allow the greatest amount of freedom within constraints? I do understand, I've been an academic, I understand the pressures of doing that. In fact, one of the reasons I started a company was because I had one of my researchers that I worked with say, why can't you just make this easier for me? I don't have time. And I was a bit offended, but I took that at heart. In what I was trying to do was get her to cite our data. I ran the Center for Biomedical Informatics at Washington University in St. Louis. And she was saying, I'm a physician, I'm a clinician, I'm a researcher, I'm tired. How do you make this easier and better for me? So that's what I looked to do. How do I make that infrastructure better for her so that trust would be easy and also sharing of the information would be easier? To answer your question, though, there are very few consequences for this. I mean, the consequences of stealing a lot of money by basically, because you're faking data and you're taking money and not giving back those results and not conducting good research, right? You have to get a long way before something happens. But that's in one area. What can, and I'll pick on my own company because we aggregate data, what can we do? We want to bring in as much data as possible and not select based on, say, journals, but then you get junk that comes in that then goes out. That information goes out. So what do we need to do? How do we build that trust into our systems? And here's the other thing that I'm going to just challenge you back on your question, is that the assumption that you made is that this is just coming from within science, within those researchers at institutions, and that's not correct. There are people all over, and that's what I was trying to make quickly, that are presuming to be a researcher who's been vetted with training that comes in and sounds as if they are an authority, and there is no institution to govern them, to say this is not okay. Maybe publishers. Preprint servers aren't fulfilling that, but there is nothing. Again, it's awful, but it's lawful right now. I will say in the research security area, there are more laws coming in, and institutions are starting to pay attention to this being very important. I'll stop there on that.
Hello? Yeah. I'm Godwin's Onwuchekwa, and I'm a community engagement specialist, and I work within academia. I'm a little bit concerned about the question of who is an author, and I wonder how the definition would be reached. There are many people in the communities who contribute to research in various ways. I think a very clear case in point is one that refers to the scientist Boyle and Papin, who was the house servant. And even today, this happens. I have worked a lot in health and public sector. There are people who are not scholars, who are not in academia, but they contribute a lot in data sourcing and providing information and all manner of aspects of research. If the definition of an author is based on scholarship, especially the Western-based context-defined scholarship, the traditional system, do we think that that would not lead to discrimination and also ignoring the contributions that these people has made to science and other areas of research?
Great question. Thank you for that. This is why I wanted to provoke this thought. What do we mean as scholarship? I would say at an individual level, that's really difficult to define. At a paper level, at a group level, it is much easier to look at trust factors, because what you just described is an environment of scholarship where people are working. And if there is provenance of a person working in that environment, then are they part of that scholarship? I would agree that yes, they are. We are balancing this with somebody coming in and saying, yes, I am an authority on this topic, and yet they are not working in that area. I'll give you an example. Somebody coming in the tobacco industry when they were perverting the publication literature when it came to tobacco, comes in, has a PhD, but has been working in real estate for many, many years, but they are seen as an authority. So there are decisions that need to be made. How are we to make those decisions? And I say this, and I will give you my background. Yes, I am from the United States. I live here in London, but I grew up, obviously, as a white woman in that country on government subsidies. That's where I came from. I have had people, I was very close to Mexico, and I've had people in Costa Rica and Central America work with me to understand some of the nuances of what it means to be excluded. And this is part of this discussion. How we put that into a paper, I think this is part of the discussion that we must have to ensure that people who are in the shadows of science, if you will, come out and are seen as part of the infrastructure that we need and the trusted infrastructure that has built this knowledge. At the same time, we have to have mechanisms for people who are using the system to manipulate it in order to move them out or to at least tag that. So I'm not sure that I came up with a solution because it's very difficult. I mean, part of the solution too is we have to make sure that we have voices from around the world who are part of the discussion to understand that you can be discriminated because you have an accent in your surname or you have two surnames. Anyone in here who have two surnames? Right? It's problematic, right? You go place you can't even remember your own name because of that. And I say that because they weren't considered authors. I worked on this with my Costa Rican engineers because they weren't considered authors in certain places because one of their names would be truncated, right? These are the subtleties that there are no easy answers for that will take time. Long answer to your very important question.
Can you hear me okay? Yes. Thank you very much for your presentation. I have a similar question to the question before. I'm worried, I'm from the Francis Crick Institute, I'm worried about the need for an association with an affiliation, given the context of lots of people finishing their studies and really struggling to get positions. To me, it seems like we can rest a bit more on what the peer review process does. Is there a reason why that's being, why affiliation is kind of taking precedent in whether or not someone is deemed legitimate as a scholar?
Yeah, let me unpack affiliation just a little bit, because one of the important pieces of this is provenance. It is not just that they are now affiliated with a place, it is the provenance of where they were before. And that gets back into the education, right? Was there a place where they had an education that they could have the provenance to show where they were from? By the way, I had a beautiful tour of the Crick Institute yesterday. If anyone has the ability to do that, go and see the building. It's absolutely beautiful. So again, none of these is one thing. Interestingly enough, in the research security space, they're very interested. This is also an integrity space, but they're very interested if somebody doesn't disclose another institution where they've been at. But I find it interesting because one of the persons that I work with in Kenya, and I work with some people in Ethiopia, are saying, you know, we have problems because we put all this education into researchers who then move to another country and they're not affiliated with where we have spent time and investment in their education. So there's actually a use case for showing the provenance of affiliations to also give credit to those educational institutions from where people have come. So I am picking on it again, but I think provenance is the key here, and this is where, personally, a place like Orchid had some information. I should have put this up on my disclaimer. I am not paid for this, but there is a co-op called Verimi that's working on these types of verifications as well and thinking through some of these problems. Peer review also can't do everything either. So I didn't mean to just drop peer review, but I also was told that I shouldn't be too long on my slides, so I, kept those shorter. It's not your fault, Mark. Not that you're going to take it. Yeah. Try it again.
Thanks for the lovely talk. I was also a part of the peer review Congress talk that you gave. My question is related to all the previous three questions, and before I start my question, I have the longest name in the conference. I also have the two last names. I also have an affiliation problem because I'm not affiliated to an institution in terms of producing my own research. So all sorts of problems combining. So my question is related to many of the things that you, including the Pharmacon investigation that you did. Everything relies on metadata, and metadata relies on infrastructure. And I know that we are short on time, but there's a big problem in terms of the industry, the community coming together in terms of maintaining an infrastructure or improving the layer in the context of AI that is coming up. I feel that in such conferences, there should be more such discussions where everybody comes together. For example, digital science has a best database that many researchers may not have access to because it's behind a wall. And I personally do not have access to it. So do you think that we are doing enough as a community to do this? And if not, if you think funding is the problem, how can we solve it? Thank you.
And I'm sorry, I missed that first question. Out of all of that, I missed.
Well, I think such conferences are not, they're not sufficiently community level discussions to solve the problem of the infrastructure maintenance. And I believe that's a lot to do with the funding that needs to be going. Thank you.
Yeah, great question, which I think will, one of the things that I'm working on, this is independent of, digital science supports this, but it is different than its forensic scientometrics. One of the reasons for this was to give a name to this field of what we're working on, because if you don't have a name, you can't get funding, and if you don't get funding, you can't help the infrastructure. So I do think that this is a critical area, and infrastructure just doesn't get funding, right? It's really hard to do that. So the first thing that I tried to do was, let's give this a name for something that we can start to work towards solutions. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Great. So thank you, Leslie. That's fantastic. Could we have a big round of applause for our opening keynote? Thank you.